Okay, in today's chapter, we're going to talk about the purpose of criminal punishment and ethical issues that may arise related to that. So, we usually use several different theories to kind of think about or justify why we punish people. We can punish them for deterrence, retribution, just desserts, rehabilitation, incapacitation, and a newer philosophy, restorative justice. We can also look at the issue of punishment from a criminological perspective, which is what we've mostly done in criminal justice, but also philosophically and sociologically. So what is punishment? We use the word punishment to describe a lot of things. We might say, this is a punishing exercise program. We also use it to talk about when we discipline children. But punishments are a sanction imposed for a criminal offense. So generally there's 5 elements involved in a punishment. It usually has to be unpleasant to the victim. It needs to be for an actual offense, for an actual offender. It has to be the work of a personal agency, so it doesn't include the natural consequences that come from our behavior. A lot of times if we make bad choices, or even if we engage in a crime, there's natural consequences for that. And then it needs to be imposed by someone who actually has the authority to do so and has ruled that the offense has indeed been committed. So what are some theoretical approaches, and why should offenders be punished? So sometimes the reasons we punish conflict. Sometimes a punishment serves more than one purpose. Some approaches are based on trying to prevent crime, and others are based on the idea that punishment is deserved. So for moral philosophers, the quote, ought of punishment is of great importance, and it leads to several questions. What should be the goals of punishment? What should be the values that we're promoting in our criminal law? And what is the purpose of punishment? For sociologists, they're really concerned with what is punishment, what punishment is actually intended for, and the nature of the penal system. And then from a criminological perspective, we're looking at penalties for offenses and policy concerns. We tend to not really think about moral or sociological implications. So let's think about the philosophical approach. There's 2 main theories here, utilitarian theory and retributive theory. And you guys are familiar with these. Utilitarian theory is the idea of preventing future crime, deterring crime from happening. And this comes from that utilitarian philosophy, where we talk about the punishment should be just enough to outweigh any benefits that someone would gain from that particular behavior. So that's future-oriented. Retribution is past-oriented. We're looking at the past actions of the offender, and we're seeking retribution from them for the crimes they committed. Basically, punishment allocates moral blame, and we're not really concerned with any future conduct. So deterrence. People are deterred from actions when they refrain from carrying them out because they have an aversion to the possible consequences. It's really hard to measure deterrence, though, because how do we measure something not happening? Some also argue, is it even morally acceptable? If it's not successful, are we then just causing suffering to someone in the name of deterrence? So as I mentioned, Bentham says punishment's only justified if the harm it prevents is greater than the harm it inflicts. And Beccaria says punishment should prevent new crimes and keep others from doing so. So utilitarians think of punishment as a means to an end. We also are familiar with individual and general deterrence. So general deterrence is that idea that a punishment exists, you are fearful of that punishment, or you don't want to have that punishment, so you won't commit that crime. Specific deterrence is you have been punished for something, you did not like that punishment, therefore you will not engage in that behavior again. So does it work? Quote, no more than a shot in the dark. So in terms of capital punishment, there's no greater effect there than life imprisonment. And Nagin looked at 3 different sets of studies: time series, ecological, and perceptual studies. So time series look at specific policies, maybe like police crackdowns on open-air drug markets. And they find that this is a temporary effect. So it does cause a decrease, but the decreases in the criminal behavior is often just displaced somewhere else and is temporary. Ecological studies look for a negative association between crime rates and punishment levels. And perceptual studies are looking at data from surveys. So self-reported criminality. So, two positions are usually debated. Bentham's position, that man is a rational being, and as a rational person, chooses between courses of actions after calculating the pros and the cons, the pain and the pleasure. The other position says this isn't very realistic, and in reality, even when we do provide some rational thought, it's not fully rational thought. Most people don't sit down and really think about all the potential consequences and benefits of behavior. It's also really dangerous to generalize. We have to distinguish between different types of offenses. So the threat of punishment affects people differently. Generally, people who are going to follow the law don't need any threat of punishment to do so. Criminal groups, even though they fear punishment, still break the law. And a potential criminal may have broken the law without any threat of punishment. So there was a study done of department store shoplifting, and amateurs were treated as professionals and reacted by changing their attitudes and experienced greater emotional disturbance. Professionals, they don't register any shock and they accept jail as a hazard of the trade. So that even though they receive a punishment, the potential rewards or the rewards from all the times they don't get caught outweigh that. When we make a punishment more frequent or more severe, that does not. Increasing the frequency or severity of a punishment does reduce the likelihood of a given crime being committed. But the key issue with deterrence is how certain a punishment is. So even if you think about your own behavior, or you think about laws that many people break, so perhaps drinking underage. Why do people break that even though they know they could get in trouble? Well, the certainty of getting caught and the certainty of getting punished is very low. So how much punishment do we need to impose in order to deter somebody? If we've got two punishments, one more severe than the other, and the less severe one will achieve the same purpose, then that's the punishment that we should choose. This still, however, can result in excessive punishment. So if we think about something like petty thefts, those are pretty widespread, right? The harm caused by each individual theft is minor, but collectively it is great. So maybe punishing one person with a serious punishment may have a deterrent effect. So retribution. Remember, retribution is looking backwards, okay? And it's basically punishment is justified because it's deserved. You're guilty of committing an offense, and therefore you need to be held accountable for it. This is a theory that assumes that society is just in making their rules and that we don't question the legitimacy of those rules. Lex talionis is the idea of an eye for an eye. Punishment should inflict the same on the offender as the offender has inflicted on his or her victim. But there's a lot of crimes that we really can't apply that to, for example, sexual assault. In cases of accidents, the fact that it was an accident would be irrelevant. But in a civilized society, we consider certain forms of punishment too cruel. So, a sadistic murderer may torture his victim, but is it a good idea for us as a society to then turn around and torture him? So people who believe in retribution believe that wrongdoers deserve to be punished, and that should be in proportion to the offense. Okay? They look at questions like, why do offenders deserve to be punishment? How are their just deserts to be calculated and translated into actual sentences? And they're paying a debt to society, not to the victim. What's their debt to society? They've breached the peace of society. Censure is the idea of we hold someone accountable while conveying the message that their behavior is bad. And this can have a deterrent effect. Censure recognizes punishment as compromising, not merely harsh treatment, but also as comprising not merely harsh treatment, but elements of condemnation, denunciation, and censure. So thinking about the different types of punishments, a fine is different from a tax, imprisonment is different from quarantine. So this is sort of a symbolic method of quote-unquote hitting back. According to Morris, punishment serves to teach offenders a moral lesson so they'll come to see what is good and choose it in the future. And that the aim of punishment then should be to persuade somebody not to manipulate or coerce them. But this doesn't really take into account what if someone has broken the law and they're already repentant. And it's also not able to really address those who understand the values of society but are basically like, screw it, I'm not going to follow them anyway. So punishment is also a communicative process. We're letting the criminal know that their behavior is not okay. The person receiving that message has to be an active participant in the process. It has to appeal to their rational understanding, and it should be focused on the offender being punished as a response to him and must be justified by his behavior. Censure could be communicated in the form of a conviction or a system of harsh punishments. The aim of the hard treatment then is to cause them to understand and repent. So what it ideally should do is direct them to understanding the harm that they've caused and accept the censure as deserved. And then the person could be, once they've paid their debt to society, reconciled with the community and restored. Another view says the criminal has taken an unfair advantage of others when they commit a crime, and that punishment restores fairness. The effect of criminal law is to bestow benefits on society, and others are not allowed to interfere with those benefits that you have. So in order to gain that benefit, you have to exercise self-restraint. And if you violate the law, you're not exercising self-restraint and you've taken unfair advantage of somebody. Therefore, punishment is deserved. So some criticisms of the unfair advantage perspective sort of distorts the nature of crime. The wrongfulness of rape is not taking unfair advantage of those who obey the law. It's also difficult to show that offenders have willed their own punishment. It's sort of an ideal theory that helps justify punishment. Others might argue that punishment is justified because it gives satisfaction. We often think that it's appropriate for criminals to be hated. So when we think about retribution, is retribution really revenge in disguise? So retribution is saying that punishment is imposed for a past crime should be appropriate to the nature of that crime. Its severity should be commensurate with that crime. Retribution is done for a wrong, whereas revenge may be done for a harm or a slight and doesn't need to necessarily rise to the level of a wrong. Revenge doesn't have any limit. Revenge is personal, and revenge is emotional. Revenge also sometimes is carried out against innocent parties, whereas retribution should only be inflicted upon the offender. Just desserts theory. Until the 70s, criminologists thought of retribution as vengeance, and by the 80s, just desserts had become influential. This is the idea that there should still be treatment programs, but treatment could take place while incarcerated. So sort of the idea that we could do rehabilitation and retribution. And one of the criticisms then of indeterminate sentencing was that there was a lot of discretion there. So these laws start being repealed and reducing the discretion that judges have. What they're hoping to have here is some consistency and certainty. So Kant is a retributivist, and he argued the aim of penalties should be to inflict desert. And that he also, remember, Kant talks about categorical imperatives, and he says that it is a categorical imperative. But that punishment should be proportionate, it should be scaled, and they should be assessed according to the seriousness of the offense. This often calls for tariff sentencing, where we don't think about the potential to commit future offenses, and previous actions do come into account because proponents of just desserts favor reductions in sentences for first-time offenders. Punishment should also always be conveying blame for wrongdoing. So advocates of just desserts focus on two dimensions: the harm involved in the offense and how culpable is the offender. Focusing then on the censuring aspect of punishment has coincided with a change in criminological thinking. So previously it was thought that blaming aspects may create obstacles to reintegration, but now the argument is that this process of blaming encourages the person to recognize what they did was wrong and make efforts in the future to not engage in that behavior. So a deterrent punishment requires the person to comply or face the consequences. A moral judgment is required from the offender under just desserts, whereas it's not really required under deterrence. So one problem here then becomes, how do we rank offenses and determine in terms of seriousness, and who gets to determine that? Some argue that this can lead to harsher punishment, but the theory itself does not argue for that. So Minnesota and Oregon both have modest penalties within their sentencing schemes. What's difficult with this theory is that there isn't a principle that helps us determine a properly commensurate sentence. So a sentence that matches what the person did. Doesn't really tell us how to do that. So it also fails to account for the problem that we live in an unjust world. So poverty, disadvantage, discrimination, and we presume equal opportunity for everybody, even though that doesn't exist. Most sentencing commissions will not allow judges to take personal circumstances into account when issuing decisions. And so it also fails to take into account that there's a lot of discretion involved. The legislature sets the range of punishment, prosecutor decides what to charge, and the judge is the final sentencing authority. But even then, the correctional authority, in places where parole is an option, have the ability to modify those sentences. So how do we reconcile this utilitarian and retributive theories? Okay, so the contrast, the difference between the two of them is that utilitarians want to control future behavior. Retributionists want to hold you accountable in terms of desert for what you deserve for your past behavior. So the issue here is, one question here is, can a retributivist ever be forgiving or merciful? But this leads us to the question of whether genuine remorse should lead to a more lenient sentence. Utilitarians are only concerned with whether a remorseful offender is likely to reoffend, whereas retributivists feel that remorse should mitigate culpability. Forgiveness is a moral sentiment, has nothing to do with punishment, and mercy is an act of forgiveness or an attitude. Mercy is not equivalent to reasoned leniency. Well, what about rehabilitation, right? So here's a third philosophy of punishment. This is a more complex notion, right? It's the idea that we want to try to reform somebody so that they don't engage in this behavior again. And it's also different from deterrence in that deterrence, people are not going to engage in that behavior in the future out of fear of being punished again, whereas under rehabilitation, someone is genuinely reformed. So their values have changed and they will refrain from committing further offenses. Punishment should be tailored to the offender and his particular needs. Under rehabilitation, the belief is that we should provide treatment, and it's really like a medical model of crime. You're looking at what are the underlying causes of that criminal behavior. Crime is really more like a symptom, and how do we address or treat those underlying issues? So one of the strengths of this is it really puts an emphasis on personal lives of offenders. It treats people as individuals. A weakness, though, is that it assumes that crime is related to disease and that we can diagnose that condition and properly provide treatment. Indeterminate sentencing gives a lot of effect to rehab because the terms of imprisonment were not fixed at trial. And so this had a lot of support during the first half of the 20th century. But now people argue that fixed sentences should be the context within which the rehabilitation takes place. As many of you probably know, rehabilitation begins to demise, or the emphasis of it demises in our system in the 70s as a result of Martinson arguing that, quote, nothing works. Well, what about when the state forces you into rehabilitation? This is termed state-obligated rehabilitation. If the state assumes the right to punishment, it should ensure that no more harm is inflicted than was intended when the sentence was pronounced. So remember, the intent of a prison sentence is deprivation of liberty, not loss of family ties or employability or other extra-legal justice that may happen while imprisoned. So states can punish offenders because they act out of choice, the offenders do. But remember that choices are often limited as a result of social conditions and circumstances. So under rehabilitation, the state should recognize the role that those conditions play. Also, though, the offender does have an obligation as well to take place in whatever programs are offered. Incapacitation is the idea that we want to place somebody in custody to protect the public from the chance of them offending in the future. In utilitarian theory, this is a good consequence, and it is also present sometimes in other forms of punishment. Parole provides a restricted opportunity. Selective incapacitation is the idea that we should try to identify high-rate offenders and to selectively incapacitate them for long periods of time. And if we could do that successfully, we should dramatically reduce the crime rate. But it's very difficult to predict criminal dangerousness. And one of the things that this is doing is punishing someone for what we predict their future behavior to look like. This works only if we lock up those who would have actually committed future offenses, and if those people are then not immediately replaced by new offenders. So some ethical questions here. Is it ethical to punish people for crimes they have not committed for what their future behavior may look like? Is it ethical to base punishment on inaccurate predictions? And is it ethical to punish a repeat offender for a past crime he or she committed and has already been punished for? We see incapacitation in things like 3 strikes, mandatory mins, and truth in sentencing laws. Now, restorative justice is the newest of these philosophies. This is the idea that we should restore both the victim and the offender and all harmed parties and the community. So our legal system really excludes the voices of victims, and this is a methodology or an approach that really includes victims. It emphasizes a need to support both victims and offenders. It sees social relationships as a rehabilitation vehicle that provides both formal and informal social support and formal and informal social control. So in the U.S., we mostly see this played out in terms of any court orders for restitution, victim offender mediation programs, and attention to interests of victims. We don't really have a lot of restorative justice here in the U.S., although it's used extensively in Australia and in some other countries. So it has 3 core principles. Justice requires the healing of victims, offenders, and communities. Those same parties should be permitted to be actively involved in the justice system, and that the roles and responsibilities of government should be rethought. So government should be preserving a just order, and the community should be responsible for establishing peace. So what makes this perspective really unique is that it incorporates the victims, offenders, and communities in its strategies. So it's focusing on repair here. But there's no theory to really explain how it brings about a change in the offender, how it rehabilitates them. But there is a heavy focus here on the offender's obligation to repair the harm done to the victims and the community. So critics say it's too easy of an assumption that it'll be possible to secure agreement amongst all these parties. It also avoids any ceremonies and rituals of criminal law that recognize these emotions. Victims may come to believe that the harm that they suffered is of less importance than quote-unquote real crime. It also might result in some net widening, where as opposed to taking people out of the system, it actually expands the number of people involved in the system. So, sociological approach, why punish? Why do we use particular punishments? How can we no longer use them? Why has most of the West abandoned capital punishment? Why is prison our major punishment? So this philosophy is looking more at, or this approach is looking more at currents and movements in social thinking and climates of tolerance and intolerance. So Garland says punishment is the product of social structure and cultural values, and who we punish, how we punish, when we punish are determined by the role we give to punishment in society. If punishment is a wrong for a wrong, then is society wronging the offender? So we have to look at the purpose of punishment and question the rationales for punishment, according to Garland. Now, Durkheim is probably one of our most, Durkheim we've talked about in terms of animate. Well, we haven't talked about it in this class, but in other classes. And says that people basically behave according to social rules that together with customs and traditions form a culture, right? So what function, Durkheim talks a lot about the functionalist perspective from sociology. So what function does punishment serve? Okay. There's 2 laws then of penal evolution here. Punishment is more intense, the less developed the society, and the more central the power that society has, and the more absolute it is. And the notion of punishments having lesser intensity. So what function does punishment serve? Well, it promotes social solidarity. It expresses outrage at the behavior. But here, the focus is not on whether punishment is effective. And so Durkheim's idea of punishment really rings true with the tough on crime perspective. So Weber talks about punishment as well and identifies 3 types of authority: charismatic, traditional, and legal. And he's arguing for legal authority. We make rules by those given the right to rule. Legal authority carries with it the duty to obey rules. So he favors formal rationality, professional police, professional judges. Marx talks about how punishment regulates the supply of labor. When labor is in high demand, punishment is lenient. And when there's excessive labor, punishment is harsh. He talks about the principle of less eligibility. Conditions offenders experience in prison must be worse than anything they would endure outside of prison in order to restrain the reserve army of labor from crime. And there is some correlation in the U.S. between punishment and the labor market. But punishment cannot simply be understood, according to Marx, as just a response to crime, that there's more to it. Foucault talks about the notion of penalty and highlights discipline as the key element in modern forms of punishment. And the central focus here is how we exercise power in a modern society. So talks about the infliction of pain on the body, that was how we generally inflicted power in the past, and how this gives way to power through the practice of disciplining the individual through our institutions. Disciplinary regulation, according to Foucault, is the fundamental principle of social control in modern society. And so the role then of punishment is to train in discipline and to produce a, quote, right-thinking citizen. And that wraps up our chapter on the purpose of criminal punishment.